We're going to take some time to explore a Buddhist perspective on anxiety, which has a lot to do with who we think we are, right? What is the nature of the self? If you read the Abhidharma, which is the primary text of Buddhist psychology, you won't find a lot of explicit references to anxiety. But you will find an incredibly nuanced description of our various stress states, right? All of our states of dis-ease, discomfort, frustration, etc. From a Buddhist perspective, all of these stress states are driven by a basic misperception of self, of who we are. And so I'm going to offer you a very simple, pithy description of self from a Buddhist perspective. It is suggested that we are actually a mosaic of constantly shifting, changing parts, referred to as the aggregates or skandhas, which means heaps. And these are just the basic aspects of our being, which include the body and feelings, mental dispositions, perception, consciousness. The problem is that we tend to invest permanent characteristics in any one of these dynamic parts of our being. And then we link those permanent characteristics with a fixed or monolithic sense of self. But in the Buddhist tradition, it is suggested that notion of a fixed, abiding, permanent self is actually an illusion. It's unfindable. But we're determined to find it. We get a little hooked. We get fixated on being who we think we are and then trying to locate that selfhood somewhere. Many of us will do it in the body, right? Which is why when the body changes, we get uncomfortable, right? Some of us will do it in the mind. If we're thinkers, if we love to parse ideas, right, we'll get a little bit overly attached to our capacity for cognition and analysis. Then if something happens that interrupts that ability to think in the way we're accustomed to, we get anxious, stressed, because we're not sure who we are anymore, right? Some of us who are very feeling-based, especially if we came from a family where feelings run high, and that's the sense of who we are, will locate selfhood and our capacity to feel. That, as you can imagine, is a little bit of a setup because, of course, our feelings are dynamic and always changing. Right? And so if someone is accustomed to feeling, let's say, excited or capable, and then they're feeling a little demoralized, right? Not so capable, it starts to stir anxiety about self. Now, this teaching is referred to in the Abhidharma as anatta, or no self. And it's a teaching which you can easily imagine is easily misinterpreted. It causes a lot of confusion because most of us are aware of our being, our personhood, which feels like self. And from a Buddhist perspective, of course, there is selfhood. There is what is referred to as relative self versus absolute self. And this is an important distinction because for those of us who perhaps are not raised in a Buddhist culture, the teaching can be especially confusing. It can sound like we're being encouraged to minimize the reality of ourselves, but actually we're being encouraged to just investigate into the truth of who we are without neglecting ourselves. So great teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Pema Chodron and many others will remind us that we have to care for ourselves, right? We have to care for our bodies. We have to care for our minds. We want to feel invested in life. We want to be able to think about our past and care about our future. But we also need to understand that who we are is always changing. We are dynamic, fluid creatures that are relationally embedded. Every aspect of our being, right? The body, the mind, is relationally embedded and therefore is going to be changing constantly. And so understanding that can go a long way toward reducing the anxiety that comes from getting too attached or too gripped by a certain notion of self. So just to give you a few examples, aging often causes a lot of anxiety, in part because if we have invested self in the body, or for that matter, if we have invested self in how we think, and the body and how we think is changing, then we start to feel disoriented, right? We start to not trust we can be who we are and continue changing. So this teaching is actually a way to notice if we have gotten overly invested in some aspect of our notion of self, and then to use the anxiety as a little bit of a signaling system, right? That we're perhaps needing to explore more deeply the truth of who we are and the nature of how we are going to be changing. We can also suffer anxiety if we have setbacks, right? If we've made efforts to achieve something and then struggled or failed. If our sense of self gets overly invested in productivity and achievement, it is a surefire setup for anxiety. And so there's actually a great deal of potential liberation in this teaching of no self, so that we begin to divest, not to not care, right, but to divest ultimate meaning from what's happening in the body, right, what's happening in our lives, what's happening in the mind, right? We start to really trust that this is all experience that's in a constant state of change. Right? Everything we are going through is fluid. And so it might potentially free us up to care about what we're trying to accomplish, right? Care about protecting the body, but without having to ward off the frustrations or the setbacks, or for instance, illness. Right? Many people will experience a great deal of anxiety around illness and aging, right? Because there's a belief that who they are by their nature is a healthy body that is productive, right? That can get things done, that can be in life. But the Buddha wanted to remind us that it is actually the nature of the body to age and to have illness and to eventually die. And that some nature of mind, some nature of selfhood is abiding, right? It doesn't all inhere in the body. Now, if we bring in a Western psychological, a psychoanalytic perspective to this Buddhist notion of self, then we can start to consider some of the deeper causes of anxiety. I've been so grateful for the work of Jack Engler, who was a beloved clinician and scholar of the Buddha Dharma. And he asked a really interesting question, which I've appreciated, which is, if self-grasping, right, if holding on to some illusory notion of self causes so much suffering, right, is a setup for all of this distress, why do we do it? Right? Most of us will tend to get pretty attached to some notion of who we are, and then frequently we will suffer if that notion is challenged in subtle ways or dramatic ways. And so Jack said, let's have a look at the reason why, the function of that self-grasping. And the Abhidharma, interestingly, that question isn't asked. What is asked is, or considered, is the fallout of that self-grasping, right? We're given lots of evidence for the suffering that we'll experience if we get too attached to a rigid notion of self. Engler wanted to suggest, and I find this to be a compelling insight, that a primary reason why we can get too fixated on a fluid notion of self is the deepest underlying anxiety about not existing in a solid way. That absence of solidity frightens us, right? But unlike fear, it's an inner threat, right? If we remember that fear is a response to an external threat and anxiety is a response to an inner threat, it is that inner awareness, because we have a deep intuitive knowing that none of us are permanent and nothing about us exists in a solid way. But because we struggle with it and we feel a little threatened often by that absence of solidity, then we basically try to transform that deeper truth into a protective truth. I can hold on to who I am. I remember when I was about 40 thinking, I'm going to find a way to just maintain being in this body, which of course was a joke, not possible, right? I remember thinking, if I can hit the pause button here, I'll be fine. But none of us can do that. And so the Buddha Shakyamuni said, and Jack Engler and people like Jack have reminded us, if we can start to grapple with the deeper truth, that we are by our nature dynamic, every aspect of our being, and start to feel a little more comfortable potentially with that truth, we will go a long way toward reducing the cause, the deepest cause of our stress and anxiety.